present. And today is a collaborative work that was actually done in my postdoc year at Warwick with Satara Kita, who's also here, and hopefully will join the discussion later. And in this study, it's an empirical study where we looked at 13 to 16-month-old infants and their communicative behaviors. And we kind of set out to test whether these communicative behaviors might reveal something interesting about their linguistic processing or understanding of sound symbolic words. And here are some of the stimuli that you could kind of see in the videos, but here they are a little bit bigger. And basically, the theoretical background of this project, it really comes from the sound symbolism bootstrapping hypothesis, which is a paper that Mutsumi Mai and Sotaro Kita published in 2014. And for those of you who are not super familiar with this area, sound symbolism is a non-arbitrary link between sounds and meaning. And in the adult literature, it has reliably been shown that adults map booba to round shapes and kiki to spiky ones. And this seems to be consistent across cultures and languages. And it also has been shown in studies with infants, even under the age of 1. So why does that matter? Why is sound symbolism an interesting part of language? It might scaffold early word learning by providing a natural link between words and reference, acting kind of like a bridge. And since this kind of idea has been proposed in the literature, people have also published empirical studies showing that adults actually do use more iconic words or more sound symbolic words with children than with other adults. And iconic words are also present in the early vocabulary, and they're among the earliest words that children learn. And infant sensitivity to sound symbolism seems to increase with age. So around the first year, findings are a little bit more robust. Now, what does the theory propose? It proposes that the vocabulary spread or the naming inside, which happens in the second year of life, it benefits from, cues in the environment, and sound symbolism is one such cue that maybe can help infants gain referential insight, which is the understanding that people use words intentionally to refer to objects, actions, and entities in the environment or in the world. And so that's kind of the bigger claim. But this theory, if you read the paper, you can also see it's based on several prerequisites, premises. And one of those is that, well, if sound symbolism has that kind of function, then it must be true, logically, that infants also understand sound symbolic word object mappings as referential, because otherwise that wouldn't have that bootstrapping function of helping them break into the language system or gaining the naming insight. So for that specific prerequisite, we designed this experimental study because there is no direct evidence yet that infants indeed treat sound symbolic parents as referential. So this is not easy to investigate. And yeah, even if you come up with a really clever paradigm or exactly the right behaviors, it is true that you're still working with infants, and we cannot claim too sophisticated things about what infants do, just because they're not ready yet to communicate clearly the choices, for example, in a forced choice task, or they don't really have that refined motor control or the voluntary ability to constantly produce pointing gestures to point at answers just yet. And for children, for example, from age 3 and up, we can be pretty certain that they do have good referential understanding of sound symbolism because they can perform these tasks. So for infants, we might have to approach this differently, but also with caution. And our solution was to look at infants' stimulus looking times in an experiment. But importantly, also look at their social looking, which is how often they look at the caregiver, who's usually present in the testing session anyway, and how often they gesture towards the stimulus on the screen or maybe towards the caregiver to get their attention. And our idea was that if you have all these multiple layers of analysis and they converge, they show the same kind of patterns of results that you would expect if they have good referential understanding, then that would be a very strong case for claiming at least emerging referential understanding in infants. So this is our experiment design. We had a 2x2 within subjects design, and we manipulated the congruency. So that was already something that you could have seen in the earlier videos. Sometimes the word matched the object the infants saw, and sometimes it mismatched the object. So that would be congruent and incongruent. And then in this experiment, we decided to give infants familiar words such as ball and shoe. And we knew that these were familiar because, first of all, we checked from existing CDI data what the age of acquisition of these words is, and we picked the earlier ones. And then we also checked for the infants that we tested whether the caregiver checked the box for these words on the CDI form that they filled in before testing. So we can say with, I say maybe 90% certainty of the familiar words that infants knew them before they did the task. And of course, there were some words that some infants didn't know, but most of them know most of the words. And then we compared that word type with sound symbolic words, like round sounding words like lumu, or spiky sounding words like tikeke, and then we paired them with round or spiky shapes. And the idea behind this is that we know for the familiar words that infants have indeed got that referential understanding, because we already know that the caregiver thinks the infants understand it. And hopefully you agree, when infants see that kind of congruent pairing, like we saw in the video earlier, they get super excited and they react in all sorts of ways. And our idea here is that if infants also understand sound symbolic words as referential, they should react to those in the same way as to the familiar words. And we had some specific hypotheses about congruency, which is our main factor of interest. But we would generally expect that they would react the same way to different word types. So for the stimulus looks and the gestures towards the stimulus, so everything stimulus directed, we thought that congruent trials would lead to more of those behaviors. For the social looks towards the caregiver and the gestures towards the caregiver, which are very social and trying to invite the caregiver into the experience, we thought that maybe infants would produce more of those behaviors in incongruent trials to kind of signal like, hey, this is conflicting with what I know, and what do you think? Like, that's maybe very sophisticated, but we thought they would respond more to incongruent trials in that way. But the key prediction here is that congruency effect should be there for familiar and sound symbolic words, if they have at least emerging referential understanding of sound symbolism. So we tested 53 infants actually, but we ended up with a sample of 40. And they were really nicely spread across 13 to 16 months. And the gender was balanced as well in the sample. And the infants saw 4 trials per condition, so 16 in total. The caregiver was generally present and kind of sat beside and behind the infant. But as you saw in the video, they were wearing headphones with music on, so they couldn't really hear the words. And they were also generally instructed not to initiate any communication with their child. But if their child initiated communication with them, they were instructed just to smile and nod and just respond as they would naturally. But generally, they were instructed not to speak or point during this task, and if they could, kind of keep their gaze away from the stimuli. So here are 4 dependent measures. So traditionally, stimulus look duration has been taken as the measure of interest in studies with like a central fixation or preferential looking paradigm. So we also included that measure, and we just measured how long they looked at the stimulus. But we added 3 more measures in our analysis approach, where social looks was another looking time measure, but we operationalized this as the rate of head turns towards the caregiver. And I think that's a really nice measure because it's quite a deliberate or cognitively effortful act to kind of stop looking at the interesting thing on the screen and really focus then on the caregiver and try to get eye contact or a response from the caregiver. So it's quite an explicit behavior. Even more so, gesture towards the stimulus. So Kita and I are both gesture researchers. And in our mind, if an infant is pointing and trying to alternate their gaze between what they're pointing at and the caregiver, this is kind of the epitome of joint attention and referential behavior. So communicative hand gestures directed at the stimulus are a really good behavior to take as initial evidence for referential understanding because they're trying to share attention on the referent with the caregiver, which means they must have some sort of understanding that what they hear goes with what they are pointing at and looking at. And our 4th measure was gestures towards the caregiver. So there it's also very nice because they are really trying to grab the caregiver's attention, and it does have a metacognitive function where they try to invite the caregiver into the experience. And in that measure, we also looked at different behaviors such as tapping the arm or grasping their hand, or sometimes they would actually point at the caregiver as well. So all these gestures were neatly coded and taken as a rate in that dependent measure. So I'm already just going to jump into the results. I hope everything is clear so far. So I'd like to start with the stimulus look duration. And I've plotted that here in milliseconds on the y-axis and by congruency on the x-axis, which was our main factor of interest. But you can also see here the word type familiar in red and sound symbolic in blue. So for this measure, what we found was an interaction effect. So here, there was a congruency effect only for familiar words. So when the infant looked at milk and heard the word milk, they just stared at it. They love to look at congruent stimuli. And this makes sense. I mean, our experiment was quite complex and long, and the stimuli altogether as a set were quite complex. And I think the Hunter and Ames model predicts that if the stimuli are a little bit more complex and the cognitive task demand is a bit higher, then one would expect a familiarity effect. So unfortunately here, we did not see the same for sound symbolic words. There, the congruency effect was not present. It was really only driven by familiar and congruent words. So our prediction was not borne out here in the traditional stimulus looking measure. So now we'll move on to the social looks towards the caregiver. And here I've plotted the rate of social looks or head turns towards the caregiver on the y-axis, and again by congruency and word type. And here we find an interaction effect as well, again, only for familiar words, but it's the exact opposite of what we've just seen. So here, what infants do is when there's something they know, familiar, but it is incongruent, they look at the caregiver to maybe request more information or to socially check in with them to see what they think. So I'm just flicking between the stimulus look. So here, familiar congruent words led to more stimulus looking, but in this measure, familiar congruent words led to less social looking. Hope that makes sense. But it is a clear pattern of results for at least the familiar words. And again, here we don't really see the mirrored sound symbolic effect that we were hoping to see. So I'm now moving on to gestures toward the stimulus. And here I should say it was the case that out of 40 infants, 39 produced spontaneous communicative gestures during the experiment. So that's in itself, it's very good. I was very happy to see that because it's not something that we knew exactly what to expect. But it is true that out of these, there were only 28 infants that actually gestured towards the stimulus on the screen. And here, when we analyzed how often they gestured towards the stimulus by congruence and word type, we didn't see any significant patterns in these data. So here we had no results. What is interesting though is that out of these gestures, more than half of these gestures were actually pointing gestures towards the stimulus. So I'm still actually quite happy that we found pointing in this experiment, that we recorded pointing, because there were only 2D images on a screen, but they still felt that they could point spontaneously to these objects, which is probably like a declarative point to maybe share attention with the caregiver. So now moving on to the last finding. So if you remember, we also had gestures towards the caregiver. So finally here, we see something really interesting. So again, I plotted the gesture towards the caregiver as a rate on the y-axis, and then congruency on the x-axis and word type in red and blue. So what you can see here is that we only found a main effect of congruency. So whenever the stimuli were incongruent, the infant gestured communicatively toward the caregiver. And they did this in the same way for familiar word-object pairs and sound-symbolic word-object pairs. And most of the gestures here were actual grasping and attempted grasping and tapping, like the caregiver's arm or body, or if they could reach maybe the leg to get their attention. So here we see a very similar result for sound symbolic words and familiar words. So our prediction was borne out. So just to give you the recap of our findings. So for stimulus look duration, we only found the congruency effect for familiar words, but not sound symbolic words. And the direction there was that they looked longer at congruent pairings. For social looks, they looked longer towards the caregiver in incongruent trials, but again, only for familiar words. And there was no effect for sound symbolic words. For gestures towards the stimulus, where the majority of the gestures were pointing, there was no effect across the conditions. And for gestures toward the caregiver, there was the congruency effect in the same direction for both familiar words and sound symbolic words, where they really communicated more in incongruent trials. So what does this mean? So we feel that when you just look at looking time measures, in our case that was stimulus looking and social looking, you can kind of see that infants have emerging referential understanding for familiar words. I hope you agree, because they reacted to those in different ways. But it's really explicit communicative gestures towards the caregiver that reveal this mismatch effect or incongruency effect for both word types. And we find that behavior really interesting. We think that that might suggest that if we really measure and code intentional communicative behaviors, that may be more sensitive index of what infants expect in terms of word-object mappings. And that does seem to be largely consistent with the sound symbolism bootstrapping hypothesis. And we take this as initial evidence that infants at least show some emerging referential understanding of sound symbolic words. So here are some conclusions and contributions of this study. So like I said, we think that there's at least initial evidence here that infants do perceive or take these words like lumu and tikeke as referential for round and pointy shapes. Infants in this study were 13 to 16 months, so that should be said. They are already definitely on the onset of symbolic communication, and they may have already produce their first words themselves. We chose this age range also because they are showing pointing gestures probably already outside of the lab, communicating with their caregiver in different ways, besides just eye gaze and eye contact. So it should be said that these infants are already over the age of 1. But yeah, we think that this multi-layer analysis approach, especially for this age, is very helpful, because maybe single measure looking time studies might miss meaningful patterns. Because if you remember, part of the trial, infants were definitely looking at the stimulus and they were very interested and engaged. But then when they look away to the mother or the father and start communicating with them, that doesn't mean they are disengaged. It would get coded as not looking, but actually they are doing something that we think is really, really interesting and that might lead to meaningful patterns. And I think our idea is that maybe researchers could combine these gaze measures or stimulus looking measures with social looking measures and gestures to provide a fuller picture of infants' linguistic knowledge so that we can kind of move beyond these low-level associative interpretations of this type of data, but hopefully toward a more sophisticated interpretation of whether infants really perceive or understand the words they hear as referential. And we think that one of the contributions of this work is that gesture is actually quite a sensitive index, especially caregiver-directed gestures, because they were the only measure to detect sound symbolic congruency in our study, and that wasn't even detected by just stimulus looking. So that underscores the idea that intentional communicative acts reflect a higher level referential expectation than implicit gaze alone. And of course, this is just the first empirical study, but we're hoping that people will try to replicate this with larger samples and maybe different ages. And I know of some really cool work where people track the longitudinal trajectory of sound symbolic sensitivity, and these layers of analysis can be applied to that as well, especially when infants go in that stage of pointing and becoming more non-verbally communicative. We also think that if there were any studies that ended up in the file drawer, maybe because that single looking time measure didn't show any result, our approach could be taken and applied to this kind of data or existing data sets with no results to resolve the file drawer problem and maybe have another look at what the multiple layers of analysis show. So we are actually sharing the coding manual and template that we developed over the years via the OSF. If anyone wants to have a look at that, I will also bring it up on my screen in a minute, because we think it's really good to share these kind of methodological protocols between infant labs. And yeah, I think I will leave it at that. But I would be very, very interested to hear from the audience if anyone is working with infant data or would be interested in maybe applying this kind of approach to a past or future study. And happy to take any questions.